Hello, everyone. Good morning. Thank you very much, Ricardo, for this very kind introduction. Let's just wait for the presentation. Yes, here we go. I was listening to Jens to present before, and I was thinking that it would be very, very hard to take the stage after Jens, but then I realized that's even harder to take the stage after the break, right? It's really hard to compete with coffee and food, especially here in Panama. So thank you very much for being here. Hopefully you are not too tired of listening to me yet. The topic that I will be addressing today is a little bit different from the one that I addressed yesterday, where I was focused in how we can manage sustainable sports organizations and how the context where these organizations are impacts in the way that they are managed and they are governed. Today my discussion will be a little bit broader, as I will be focused in how different countries shape their sports governance structures and how these sports systems they are governed. Usually when we came across a research or a report or even a news about governance in sports, the topics raised are transparency, integrity, accountability, human rights, and so on. These issues, they are concerned with organizational management and structure of sports organizations. And of course, they are legitimate and they are relevant aspects of the field. However, as important as these aspects are also the ones related to how organizations related to each other in our sports context, how they are regulated by external forces that impose their own rules through specific systems. So these components, they are important because through the adoption of governance principles and guidelines, as well as structures, different sports organizations are able to deliver their services, fulfilling their missions, and most importantly, being transparent and ethical while being recognized and accepted by the most diverse range of stakeholders. Despite an increase in academic research about sports governance in the last 2 decades, despite a very broad dissemination of guidelines and codes about good governance in sports in the past years, and the international recognition of the importance of the topic for the development of sports, it is still very difficult to conceptualize sports governance. And I think that we heard that yesterday in the last panel that we attended. It's even hard to fully implement this concept in small organizations, or to change organizational culture to accommodate this new process. Especially when the most common words linked to governance are power relations, decision-making process, control and evaluation, and stakeholders' interests. All of these features, they come with the need of adaptation, the need of dialogue, the need of cooperation, and more important, a willingness to cooperate it. So one academic tool, and I'm sorry to talk about academic tools and academic research, but I think that's really important for us to be able to align the academic knowledge with the practical outcomes that we have in our organizations. So saying that one good academic tool that we can apply in our sports organizations, we can use to analyze how we implement governance in our organizations, breaks the concept of governance in different domains or areas, as you can see in this image in the slide. So we have two main areas or two main governance pillars that the academic literature calls systemic governance and good governance in sports. Of course, when thinking about how sports systems they are operated in sports organizations, it's not possible to clearly separate these two different areas. They are interconnected and they are mutually dependent. When an organization implements good governance practices, they will operate changes in the way that they're going to reflect in these organization interactions with other organizations, or the ones that they will be evaluating by or analyzing and enforcing these changes in sports organizations. So having this in mind, the main goal of this presentation is to discuss these different concepts of governance, to analyze some study cases of how governance structures can vary in different countries, and debate how this standardization of good governance principles are being implemented by different organizations. So very, very briefly, starting with the concept of organizational governance, and this is what we were discussing yesterday and today in the morning. The idea of organizational governance is to set up the principles of good governance. How can we implement these principles in our organizations? Is the concept linked to how organizations are structured, how they are managed, and it relies on the process and policies of sports organizations. So all of the good governance codes, all of the good governance guidelines that we have been seeing in these past 2 decades, they are related to organizational governance in sports organizations. It represents the adoption of norms and values in which these organizations believe and they promote it. Or so it should be. When we are talking about strategic management, strategic focus yesterday, we were talking about how the organizational governance in the sports organizations should operate it. So what Jens was saying before about athletes' rights or about human rights protection, athletes safeguarding, anti-corruption policies, and so on. They are the most commonly kind of good governance principles that we can see in sports organizations. But unfortunately, they are not so commonly followed. Now, moving away a little bit about the concept of organizational governance to a more broad view of sports systems, we reach the concept of systemic governance, which recognize and discuss the many different relationships existing between sports stakeholders. When analyzing the systemic governance of sports, we can see it through different perspectives. In the slides image, you can see how relationships in sports could be analyzed through the point of view of athletes as the central component. Athletes in many different countries are linked to a number of different sports systems at the same time. However, only very recently we started to see sport organizations addressing policies aimed to protect these athletes. So in this case, who or what was the central component of sports systems before? Organizations? Shouldn't they be the ones to work to make policies happen for athletes? Independently of who or what organizations are in the center of the system of systemic governance, the concept is linked to the relations of cooperation and competition that sports entities or sports agents establish with other organizations they are linked to. Systemic governance takes place in the mutual relationships established in the sport environment by its constituents. Sometimes these relationships are harmonic and very effective. Other times, these relationships could be very, very problematic and difficult. The final concept of governance that I will present today is the political governance, and we have been talking a lot about sports autonomy and politics in sports and so on. But actually, the political aspect is a very important aspect of governance. It is an arm of the systemic governance concept, and it is still related to interconnections between organizations. But the political governance is related to the way or to how regulatory bodies indirectly lead and steer sports organizations. This concept refers to the interests and aspirations that government have in the different outcomes related to sport policies. It is a mechanism through which the implementation of strategic actions become useful for achieving social but also political objectives. In this picture that you are seeing in the slide, you can see the amount of fundings invested by governments in elite sports in different countries. These numbers are in millions of dollars last year in 2023. This leads us to question, what is the intended outcome of this investment? And what are the role these national governments play in the governance of Olympic sports system? As we can see here, and probably it's a little bit small down here, but the blue color means national government direct investment. The orange one is the money that came from lottery laws. The gray one from the National Olympic Committee, and the black one from Paralympic sports. We can see that different countries have different averages of investments in sports, but we can see that the largest amount of money comes from national government or lottery law, which is also public funding. So it's really important for us to question, what does governments want by investing in Olympic sports? This, I'm talking about Olympic sports systems in each of these nations. So, as I said before, this is an analytical tool that we can use to analyze different aspects related to governance in sports, but they are all dependent of each other. So, the first point that I would like to make here is that, of course, analyzing good governance principles is very important, but we really need to start to think about the broader picture. We really need to start to thinking about how the systemic governance can impact sports organizations, athletes, governments, and so on. So if we can discuss this as separate domains in the academic field, the outcomes of the policies are a product of the relationships between these different areas. So having this concept in mind and all these questions in mind, 3 main points I would like to highlight before we move into the study cases around the world. Organizational governance is a fundamental stone in sports organizations. However, to be an efficient and to be a satisfactory tool, it needs to be related to how stakeholders in the sports systems have their relationships set. System and political governance are necessary to guarantee a clear distribution of responsibilities between public authorities, private actors, and the society. In some cases, as we will see in the next few minutes, these roles rely on national governments in one side and national bodies linked to the Olympic system in the other. In other cases, a range of different players and stakeholders are part of this system. And in many cases, the responsibilities and roles of them are not very clear. This is a very clear snapshot about how the international governance of sports is structured. We have been talking about governance and the roles of each organization and how they fit or how do they not fit in different sports systems, but the features of this image that we can see here are common to almost all sports systems and countries around the world. What changes between them is the national structure that sustains the system, and also the extent that it is compatible with the international standards. So one important aspect of this picture here is to think about, in our sports organizations or in our national governments, how the relationship with these other bodies is set. We have already heard some examples about national laws. We already had some examples about funding links between these organizations. We have been questioning the role of these regulatory agencies. Are they enough? Are they not enough? Do they fit the purpose that they were conceived for or no? And so on. Another idea is to think about these different groups as separate and independent groups. We were talking about sports autonomy again. But in the practical field, in the policy outcome, they are all interconnected, they are all related. And when I said before that maybe we should think about athletes as the center of our systemic governance, I'm talking that because usually when we have an athlete or when we have a child or a youth that will start to play sports, they start to play sports in schools, in regional or local government sport programs, in clubs, and so on. So how can we have a better structure or a more efficient structure between all of these players to guarantee that our system is really delivering what we are planning to? Talking about a little bit this context that probably you all know much better than I do, but maybe a good question that we could ask ourselves about different sports organizations is, where are we in this sports structure? What are my role in this sports structure? And what is the model that can fit me or can best provide me a structure to deliver my actions? When we, I think I missed a slide. Yeah, I forgot. Maybe I didn't put the slide here. But the point that I was trying to make was that we have some academic research that is trying to understand how the same governance structure can fit in different countries. And some of these researchers, some of these academics, they are calling it a transplant of systemic governance. What they mean about transplant? They mean that we have, for example, the Olympic system or the Olympic governance structure, and they offer this to different countries, and of course they can choose to implement or they cannot choose, they can choose not to implement it, but if they want to be part of the Olympic system, they should implement it. But how does these structures connect with the structure that I have in my own country? How can I make these connections? How can I make this systemic governance work? So when thinking about these roles of these different organizations in Europe, in Asia, in Oceania, or North America, they are different from the ones that we have here in South America. Here we still have a culture of association and club governance model, which is predominant. We still have the sports infrastructure pretty much attached to governments and funding from governments. And for a long, long time, we have been seeing governments very active in the all financial of sports. If they are not active, unfortunately, we don't have financial for sports. I think that we had a presentation before that talked about the roles of governments in sport policies and how we can see that. And yesterday, some people were asking me some questions about what can we do to pressure our governments to implement sport policies as a national sport policy. Because I, as the National Olympic Committee by myself, I cannot provide sports for all, I cannot provide grassroots sports, and I cannot provide elite performance sports. So how can I do all of that? Or how can I pressure my government to offer that? Here is a snapshot about how different governments, they see the sports roles in different countries in Latin America. Some of them, they recognize the right of sports for its citizens, and some of them recognize the importance of promoting sports. What is the difference? There's a huge difference when we are thinking about sports system, when we are thinking about sport policies. In the ones that recognize the right of sports for its citizens, so if my population has a right, I have a duty to provide them with their rights. But if I recognize the importance of sports, it's quite different. My role in the system could be different. Just one very quick question for the team in the back. I think that I have the wrong presentation. Sorry? Un momento, sí, muchas gracias. Muchas gracias. Thank you. Cheers, thank you very much. So the paper that I was talking about before, it makes very clear the point that I was talking about, how we can see these different roles from different governments related to sports. This is a paper that asks the questions about how the autonomy of developing countries is related to the Olympic movement, how we can assist countries from the global south to develop their sports systems, and in this broader movement also encompass the Olympic system. This paper discusses 3 different study cases: Guatemala here in Latin America, but also Botswana in Africa, and also Sri Lanka in Asia. And Guatemala was the model case that the authors of the paper said that would be the ideal fit for the Olympic system. But actually, a little bit before they published this paper, Guatemala had a problem with the National Olympic Committee, and they were suspended for, I don't know how much time, but they need to figure out how they would work that. So this is just one example about even when we have the right structures, things can go wrong. So it's really important for us to think about what does really fit us in a way that we are not accommodating external pressures without thinking about our own reality, our own context. Okay, now moving already. Already talked about this and this. Okay. So one important aspect about that, different relationships. And as said before, I think that someone said it yesterday, but I heard today as well. During these different periods of time, we have been seeing that cultural and contextual aspects are important when analyzing governance structures. So there is no perfect model. I choose 4 different governance structures for different countries to showcase today. But first thing, I would like to say that there is no perfect model. There are one model that maybe works better in some contexts, there another model that maybe doesn't work and it's not going to work in my case, and so on. I will start with the UK. The sports structure in the UK, it's very clear, it's not too much complicated to understand. We have 2 main bodies responsible for delivering the sports in the UK. And when I say that it's not too complicated, doesn't mean that works out very, very fine and there is no complaints and there was no one pointing out issues about these policies. Of course, they are. But each of the bodies that we have in the UK, they have their responsibilities, their roles very well specified. So there is no overlapping in the actions. Each of them is responsible to deliver one particular type of sports, and so when we are evaluating these organizations, we know what we are looking for. As the national body responsible for sports in the UK, and we are talking about the UK, so it englobes England, Scotland, Northern Ireland, and Wales. We have the sport policy, the Department for Culture, Media, and Sports. But they are not the ones responsible for designing the sport policies in the UK. They are the ones responsible for overseeing these policies. The bodies that we have in the UK that are responsible to deliver the sport policies are the Sport England and the UK Sports. Each of them, they have their own specific roles in the system. So we can see that We can see that UK sports is linked to the elite sports in the UK. So their focus, their strategic focus, is related to medals, performance, success. It is very clear. In the other side, we can see that Sports England mission is to invest in sports and physical activity to make it a normal part of life for everyone in the UK. So we can see that we have grassroots and participation sports tied to the Sports England, and we have the elite sports tied to the UK sports. And when I said before that it is very clear the roles of these organizations, it is. But the problems that they are facing there is regarding funding for sports. How much money each of these organizations can make. Yesterday I brought here an example about the government saying that they're going to increase the funding for elite sports in 10%. Do you think that we have the same news for the Sport England? No, unfortunately we didn't. So this is a very good example about a solid structure, a solid governance structure, but that faces problems when implemented different policies. Talking about governance issues in England, in the past few decades, governance has become an increasingly important issue in the UK, so we have been seeing different codes, different guidelines for these organizations to comply. And since 2004, different sports organizations and governing bodies have been issuing these governance codes. So UK Sports has its own code. Sports England has had its own code until 2016, where they decided to merge those different codes. And now all of their sports organizations in England, if they want to receive public funding, they need to obey to the same code, independently if they are delivering grassroots sports or independently if they are delivering elite sports. So the important feature of the governance structure in the UK is that after a lot of reforms, a lot of debating, now we have more than 4,000 sports organizations in the UK using the same governance guide. They know that they need to comply with. So they are not arguing, they are not find any issues about complying with this governance code. It's already set in stone. Moving from the UK to another similar country in terms of how the sports is structured, but with a very huge difference in how it's delivered, is the New Zealand context. New Zealand is not a very, very big country in terms of population. It's a big country in terms of land, but not in population. And they also have one single body in the national government responsible for sports, which is the New Zealand sport. The approach that New Zealand sports uses to delivery and to guarantee the development of sports is quite different from the one that we have in the UK. When we are talking about development of community or participation in sports, the national organizations is connected with 17 regional organizations that are autonomous, non-profit, and shared funded, from a combination of sports of government funding, lottery, and also private contracts. The funding for these 17 different organizations comes directly to the national sports organizations. The idea is that these organizations, they have a very clear goal about what they are trying to achieve, and they should be connected with the increase in participation levels for sports, and also some priorities set out by the government. When we are talking about elite sports development in New Zealand, we have the High Performance New Zealand body, which is connected to the Sports New Zealand, but is an independent body, and it works in partnership with the national sports organizations and other organizations in the country. We can see that these relationships, they work by the way that organizations are linked to each other, as we can see in the chart. So we have different kinds of connections, as we can see here in the arrows. We have hierarchical relations that are only set between the national sport organizations and the regional sports organizations. We have member organizations linking to the regional ones and the sport clubs. We have partnerships between local governments and sport clubs, most used by infrastructure. And we also have funding connections between the Sport New Zealand, the high performance, and the national sports organizations. One important aspect related to governance in the system of New Zealand is that the main body responsible for sports and for distributing the financial resources for sports operated under a logic of competitive market. And here's the main difference between the UK sport structure and the New Zealand one. This environment is characterized by competition between sports organizations about funding. This is because Sport New Zealand focuses in support capable organizations. So they need to be efficient, they need to deliver in order to receive fundings. Organizations interested in applying for fundings, they need to go directly to the website for call for applications. And they need to apply for the funding that they were looking for. They need to comply with all of the requirements from New Zealand. And thinking about how can this work out in different contexts, it is a very innovative and market-oriented governance structure. Could it work in different countries? Depends. Depends how mature is my governance or my governance structure in my country. If we are still arguing, if you are still facing issues regarding organizational governance, about good governance principles, maybe this is not the best way that I can approach it. But it's a very innovative way, and it is allowed because these organizations, they have a very mature management practices. So here in these examples, I can show you the guidelines that they have to support these organizations through the process of funding. So they have governance guidelines, but they also have leadership guidelines, and they also have financial guidelines to help these organizations apply for fundings in New Zealand. Maybe making a very, very drastic change. Analyzing the Chinese case of sports governance, it's very complicated, and I must admit that I'm only doing that because I was very kindly asked to talk about this case. But it is a very contradictory case in the sports system. It's a very contradictory case when we are talking about autonomy of sports, about power relations, and about how good governance structures should be. But even so, I will not explore this case very deeply, but I would like to make the point about the concept related to how the autonomy of sports can be analyzed in different perspectives, in different contexts. I think that yesterday we heard that each case is a case, and each case should be analyzed very carefully under the IOC structure. So in China, the management of sports is mainly linked to the General Administration of Sports, which is the Chinese government agency responsible for sport policies. It's a very hierarchical structure and includes also the Chinese Olympic Committee and the national sports federations. Here's a chart where we can analyze this, what seems a very simple structure for sports governance. And probably the first thing that came to your mind is that I show you the same chart from UK and from New Zealand, and we have 3 different blocks in each of them. Here we don't have the third block, because all of the sports structure is pretty much linked to the government structures, or the semi-government structures as they call. We can see that there's also a big change about how these relationships are made. If before we saw some lines about funding, about partnerships, about collaboration, here we can see that it's a pretty much hierarchical kind of relationship pretty much tied to funding and supervision, which was a word that we didn't see in the other charts. So, as I said, I'm not going to make a huge analysis about this case, but just some big concerns about this model. During decades, the drive force of development of sports in China was the elite sport performance, the focus on medals brought besides the sportive results that they have, problems related to bribery, doping scandals, and also match-fixing issues. Now China is facing an enormous problem related to the very low physical activity and sport rates among children and youth, as a result of poor policies focused in grassroots sports and participation in sports. However, it seems that in the past few years, the central government is empowering the local bodies in order to improve sport policies, seeking to increase the participation of the population in sports. Another point that I would like to make here, as I said before, there is no perfect model. It is really hard for us to just grab a model, a sports system model, and try to implement in our country. But I think that this case highlights the problem about focus one national sport policy in a very single strategic focus. Now, the whole country is facing the consequences of a policy that was in place for the past 30, 40, or even maybe more years. But, as I said, I'm not going to go very deep inside these aspects. This is just what I mentioned. And of course, all of this information, it's published according to academic standards. But now going back home, for a place closer to here, and Brazil is my home, I don't live there, but I feel it's still my home and it's going to be for a long time. Talking about a sports structure that try to, I'm not going to say copy, but benchmarking what England made with the sports system. Brazil tried to do something similar, but as you can see here, we can put all of Europe inside of Brazil, so of course things are not so simple, of course things are not so easy to adapt it. Talking a little bit about the role that the government has in the sports systems in Brazil, as showed before, since 1988, we have in our constitution that every single Brazilian has the right to practice sports and physical activity. And since then, we have several laws regulating the funding for sports, the sport policies, and how these organizations should operate in Brazil. Besides these laws, besides all of these legal frameworks that we have in the country, and many funding mechanisms, of course, this right to have access to sport and physical activity is not a reality for many of the Brazilian population. This is because we have a few issues would be very too kind. I would be very kind. We have some issues related to the Brazilian sport policy and context. In the past 2 decades, Brazil hosted the biggest sport events in the world. The political choice impacted the sports context in many ways. The funding for sports has a great variation during this period. We had very massive investment in sports. Elite sports programs were issued to improve the chances of the country to perform well at home. I'm not mentioning the World Cup, please, nobody mention that. But as fast as these programs they were issued, they were created, some of them just disappeared after 2016. As the country is still trying to understand the legacies of the FIFA World Cup and the Olympic Games, a change in the national political context also impacted the sports governance structure. The national body responsible to design and implement sport policies was dissolved, and I don't think that I need to talk too much about the relevance of a Ministry of Sport because Nicholas already gave us many insights about it. So, With this very complex and dynamic context in mind, we can analyze the governance structure in the Brazilian system and all of the stakeholders that are immersed in this area using the chart, which is not a very easy chart to understand, but trying to explain a little bit. Here in the green color, we have what should be the grassroots sports. Moving forward between this colorful area, we have the high performance or the elite sports. And then in this pink and a little bit purple area, and the darker green here, we have the sport for life. What is very interesting to think about this model is that it seems very good. But the problem about it is that we have too many organizations inside the same area. So we have a lot of people here competing to deliver elite sport for the population. We don't have too many stakeholders involved in the grassroots sports and participations. And what should be this very big area that we all are immersed in as community or society, we have only few stakeholders involved. And I don't know if you're going to remember about that chart that I showed you in my presentation yesterday about the average of the investment of public funding for the local sport bodies in Brazil. These are the sport bodies that I was talking about yesterday. So how can we have sport for life for the population if I have that very dynamic investment in sport? In the opposite side here, in this small blue area, we have several laws guaranteeing the funding for these organizations. We have national lottery law. We have also what we call the Athletes Fellowship, which is a funding that we invested directly in sports, in athletes, in their coaches, and so on. So as I said, there is no perfect model. We would have a very interesting sports context in Brazil if this model could work in a more efficient way. But actually what we do have in the practices is this very bureaucratic and boring chart, where we have again the Ministry of Sports. It took place 2 years ago again. We have all of these public bodies responsible for sports, and in the other side, we have the Olympic system, or the organizations in the federal system delivering the sports. They should be better connected. They should be better balanced in terms of sport policies if we would like to deliver the sport for population as should be in this model that I showed you before. Moving forward, talking about governance. The elite sports system in Brazil has been steered by national lottery law since 2022. The law also granted power to the National Olympic Committee and the Paralympic Committee to govern the national system and set the goals and the objectives of the national organizations. Some of them only have access to funding that comes from the Brazilian National Olympic Committee. The federal government in this system now sets the governance standards and governance principles that all these organizations need to comply with to be able to receive public funding. In terms of how the Brazilian Olympic Committee steer these organizations to funding, here I brought the list of the criteria that they use to distribute the fundings. So all of the money from the national law, for the national lottery law, goes to the Brazilian Olympic Committee, and they use these 13 principles to distribute this money. What could be a problem here is that out of the 13 criteria, 11 of them are related to performance. And I know that you don't read Portuguese, and I'm sorry, I didn't have time to translate all of them, but I would like to mention a few of them. First of them, the first criteria is the number of athletes that won medals in the Olympic Games. It's a very high standard to deliver funding for sports organizations. The second criteria is the number of medals won by each of the athletes. How many Brazilian athletes won more than one medal in the last Olympic Games? Maybe you're going to remember Rebeca Andrade, not because of Rebeca Andrade, but because of Simone Biles. So these criteria are used for the Brazilian Olympic Committee to distribute their funds. Where is governance here? Number 12 and number 13. Number 12 means accountability of sports organizations, and the number 13 is a program that the Brazilian Olympic Committee raised related to management, ethics, and transparency in sports organizations. And so these organizations, they need to comply with 9 different pillars, answer 90 questions to be able to contribute 5% in the way that the funding is distributed in Brazil. So I'm talking about 13 principles. This is one of them, and the weight of this principle is 5% in how the Brazilian Olympic Committee sets the criteria to distribute the public funding for these organizations. So, as I said before, there is no perfect model, but there are a few implications that we should consider when analyzing governance structures in different countries. National structure is relevant when analyzing sport policies, designs, and governance structures. Countries might seek similar outcomes through sport policies, however, the paths that they decide to pursue to achieve them are diffuse, as well as their effectiveness in attaining to these outcomes. Political self-restraint and strong civil society are prerequisites for autonomous sports structures. Tensions between the government, sports agents, and the autonomous national Olympic committees occur regularly, although they are usually solved on the basis of shared commitment to national sport development, or they should be. And yeah, I think that this is all. Thank you very much. Muchas gracias.